The bobcat refused to move. Not when she stood. Not when she cried. Not even when her husband shouted at him to back away. He stayed pressed against her swollen belly, a low, constant hum in his throat, not a growl, not a purr, something in between. A sound that didn't match the room. A sound that didn't belong to comfort or danger. It just was. Lena stood barefoot on the cold hardwood floor, her back pressed to the wall, her hands trembling slightly. She wasn't sure when her tears had started. They weren't from pain. Just confusion. The kind that comes when everything familiar starts to feel strange. For the last 6 days, Sage hadn't left her side. But today, he was different. Not clingy. Not alert. Still. Quiet. As if listening for something inside her. His body, once wild and reactive, had turned into something impossibly still. Like stone warmed by breath. His ears twitched. His eyes flicked toward her face. Then back to her stomach. The room was lit by gray morning light, rain tapping softly against the windows, the outside world blurred behind streaks of water. She hadn't spoken in hours. There was nothing to say. Only this quiet staring match between her and an animal who wasn't supposed to love this way. She moved to sit. He moved with her. Gently. Carefully. One paw reached across her lap as she lowered herself onto the couch, and he lay back down across her midsection, the way he had each day since the cramp started. Not possessively. Protectively. Like he was shielding something. Like he knew more than she did. He'd never acted like this. Not in all the years he'd lived with them. He used to be independent, always out patrolling the trees, climbing the shed roof, sunbathing under the old swing. Now, he was her shadow. But not just hers. The baby's. That thought hit her like a wave she couldn't hold back. She reached for him, slowly, placing her hand on his back. The muscles beneath his fur were tense. Coiled. Waiting. For what? The house groaned softly as the wind shifted. A soft creak came from the nursery door down the hall. Mark had closed it the night before, but it was open now, just a sliver. Sage turned his head, eyes locked on the gap, but didn't move. Lena followed his gaze, heart knocking against her ribs. The silence inside the house wasn't empty. It was full. Full of the weight of questions she didn't know how to ask. Outside, the barn stood quiet beneath the gray sky, its faded redwood damp from the rain, a shallow puddle forming where the roof sagged above the left door. The forest beyond it blurred into mist. Somewhere in the distance, a single raven called out once, then stopped. Lena took a breath. Sage didn't. He was listening. Not to her. To something inside her. She closed her eyes for a moment and let herself feel it, the pulsing rhythm low in her belly, the rolling discomfort that had returned just before dawn. Not sharp. But heavy. Constant. Like a warning from something too deep to reach with words. When she opened her eyes again, Sage was staring at her, not blinking, not shifting. Just watching. As if waiting for her to understand. And in that moment, something cracked. It wasn't the pain. It wasn't fear. It was the realization that this animal, who'd come into her life as a half-starved survivor, wasn't protecting her anymore. He was protecting something else. Someone else. She tried to stand again, but he blocked her gently, rising with her and pressing his side against her legs until she steadied herself. Then he walked ahead, slow and deliberate, leading her down the hallway toward the nursery. She didn't call him. He just knew. The door opened with a soft push from her hand. The room smelled faintly of cedar and fresh paint. The crib stood waiting by the far wall, a single folded blanket lying untouched on the mattress. The rain traced thin fingers across the window, and the trees outside moved like slow dancers in the mist. Sage stepped inside first. He walked in a circle around the crib, then sat. Still. Silent. She stood in the doorway, breath caught somewhere between now and what might come next. Sage looked back at her once, then returned his gaze to the crib. She stepped inside. Her footsteps barely made a sound. She lowered herself into the rocking chair, one hand resting on her stomach, the other reaching for the carved armrest. A soft kick nudged her palm. Followed by another. She smiled, faint and uncertain. Then her eyes welled again. Sage rose. He padded over to her side, pressed his forehead gently against her knee, and then curled beneath the chair. Not like a pet. Like a guardian. She rocked once. The room exhaled. And for the first time that morning, the storm outside seemed very far away. Rain soaked the earth with a patience no human could mimic. Each drop settled into moss and soil, dripping slowly from pine needles, tracing the edges of fallen leaves until they disappeared into the roots below. The forest beyond the barn breathed in silence. No rustling. No birdsong. Just the low hum of water finding its way home. Lena stood on the back porch, barefoot again, one hand on her lower belly, the other braced on the wooden beam beside her. The porch boards were damp beneath her feet. Not puddled, just chilled with moisture, the kind that lingers even after the storm has passed. Mist rolled across the clearing like low fog, thick enough to blur the shape of the barn. Morning hadn't fully arrived, but the sky was lightening behind the clouds, a gray wash of stillness that made the world feel like it was holding its breath. Sage stood beside her. Not touching. Just near. He didn't look at her. He looked out, toward the trees. Ears angled forward, tail low, shoulders rising and falling in rhythm with his breath. There was no tension in his body. Only focus. A quiet knowing. As if something was always just past the tree line, just out of view. He'd led her out here before. Twice this week, at the same time, just after dawn. No urgency. No sound. He would simply rise from wherever he'd slept and walk toward the door, waiting for her to follow. This time, she had. Her robe clung to her sides, damp from the mist. Her hair was loose, dark curls against her shoulders, strands sticking lightly to her cheeks. She looked like a woman caught between sleep and story. And maybe she was. The barn sat like a silhouette in the distance. Once bright red, its paint had faded to something between rust and gray, weathered by years of storms and summer heat. The roof sagged gently in the middle. A single shutter hung crooked above the loft window. No one had used it in years. But Sage watched it now. Not for the first time. Lena followed his gaze. The loft window hadn't been open yesterday. She was sure of it. But now it was, just slightly. Enough to let the wind breathe through. She stepped forward, unsure why. Sage followed, his paws soundless on the wet ground. He didn't rush ahead or glance back. He simply stayed beside her, adjusting his pace to hers. The earth squished softly beneath her steps, cool and pliant. The scent of pine needles and old wood mixed with the dampness in the air. When they reached the barn door, it moved slightly on its hinge, a subtle creak, like an old voice whispering something half-remembered. She placed her hand against the wood. It felt warm. Somehow, despite the rain. Sage brushed past her legs and entered first. She hesitated. Inside, the barn smelled of hay long gone, of dust and bark in time. Light spilled through the cracks in the boards, creating thin ribbons across the floor. Sage moved in slow arcs around the space, his tail low, nose twitching. He wasn't hunting. He was looking for something else. Or maybe checking that it hadn't returned. In the far corner, beneath a low shelf of stored lumber, was a spot he'd visited before. She'd noticed the pattern only yesterday. Small indentations in the hay. A patch where the dust had been disturbed, swept into half-moons by something lying still. Something cat-shaped. Sage sniffed the spot once, then lay down. Facing her. Lena leaned against the frame of the door and watched. There was no sound. No movement. Just breath. The longer she stood there, the more the barn seemed to pulse with memory. She could almost hear the way it used to creak at night when the wind caught just right. The way the boards thudded beneath her father's boots when he carried firewood inside. She remembered being small, sitting on this floor in summer, feeding the barn kittens one by one, their bellies round with milk. She hadn't thought of that in years. And yet, here she was. Pregnant. Barefoot. In the same barn. With a bobcat at her feet who seemed to know something she didn't. She crouched slowly, one hand braced on her thigh, and sat down on the wooden step. Sage didn't move. He blinked slowly, as if acknowledging her without expectation. A small wind moved through the open loft window above. It stirred the dry remnants of straw along the beams, creating a soft rustle like distant pages turning. Then something strange happened. Sage looked up. Not fast. Not startled. Just, up. Toward the loft. His eyes locked on the shadows near the window. Not with fear. Not with alertness. But with recognition. Lena followed his gaze. There was nothing there. But her chest tightened anyway. A shape. A shift in the light. She wasn't sure. Maybe it was the wind playing tricks. Or maybe not. Sage stood again, walked once around the base of the ladder that led to the loft, and then returned to her side. He brushed against her knee. Saturday. Looked up again. Not waiting for her to act. Waiting for her to understand. She didn't. Not yet. But something lodged in her throat, a knot of uncertainty, of memory, of something too deep to name. The rain had stopped now. The mist had started to lift. And somewhere, in the shadowed space above the barn, something remained unexplained. By the fourth morning, Lena no longer questioned the ritual. Sage would rise just before dawn, slip from the edge of the bed where he'd taken to sleeping, and wait at the back door. No sound. No signal. Just presence. As if something older than habit pulled him toward the clearing. And now, she followed without hesitation. She wrapped her shawl across her shoulders, careful not to disturb the quiet of the house, and stepped into the soft chill of morning. The air was thick with the scent of wet pine and moss, and the trees stood like statues wrapped in mist. The barn loomed ahead, half concealed in the gray. And always, Sage led the way, never rushing, never checking to see if she followed. Because he already knew she would. They didn't speak. Of course they didn't. There were no words for this kind of thing. Instead, they moved together like a pair of shadows tracing an invisible path. Each step placed with care. Each pause shared. Inside the barn, the silence was full again, alive with memory and breath and something else. Something waiting. Sage settled once more in the same corner, his body pressed close to the earth, eyes trained upward toward the loft. He didn't pace. He didn't explore. He watched. Lena leaned against the wall, one hand resting gently on the rise of her stomach, feeling the slow rhythm of life beneath her skin. The baby moved more these days. Small nudges. Flutters. Presses from the inside out. They arrived mostly in these early hours, as if answering Sage's quiet summons. She had come to expect them now. These shared moments between beast and unborn child. As if the two were somehow already in communion, speaking through muscle and breath and instinct. She felt more like a vessel than a mother. Like her body was a bridge between wildness and becoming. Sage's ears twitched. He stood slowly, padded toward the base of the ladder, and sat again. Looking up. Always up. Lena followed his gaze once more, eyes tracing the narrow beams and dark spaces beneath the roof. Nothing moved. Nothing stirred. But the unease settled a little deeper each time. She didn't climb. Not yet. Instead, she walked over to Sage and sat cross-legged on the ground beside him, her knees aching slightly as she lowered herself. He shifted only slightly to make space. Then leaned in, pressing the side of his head lightly against her arm. She exhaled. The barn smelled of wood soaked in memory. Damp beams. Dust. Forgotten nests tucked behind warped boards. She let her fingers drift through Sage's fur, coarse at the top, soft underneath. He didn't flinch. Didn't blink. Just let her be near. In that space between them, no explanation was needed. Each morning after that followed the same shape. Sage waited. She followed. The forest would mist and clear. The light would shift across the beams. The baby would stir. Sage would sit beneath the loft window. And Lena would wonder. She began to notice other things, too. At home, Sage had taken up residence beside the crib. Not just occasionally. Always. At night, he would curl around its base. During the day, he would pace softly between the nursery and the living room, as if guarding a threshold no one else could see. Once, Mark entered the room too quickly and Sage rose fast, body tense, tail low. He didn't growl. But he stood between Mark and the crib until Lena walked in behind him. Only then did he sit back down. Mark stopped questioning it after that. He didn't like it, but he didn't challenge it again. Lena began journaling what she saw. Not out of fear or superstition, but reverence. She scribbled in small, slanted handwriting, details of Sage's patterns, how he responded to her breathing, how he touched her belly when the baby kicked. She noted the exact time he paused at the base of the ladder. 5:47 a.m. Every morning. It wasn't random. It was ritual. And it felt ancient. One evening, just after dusk, she sat on the porch while the wind picked up through the trees. A soft rain had started again, and the sky glowed faint orange beneath the clouds. Sage sat at her feet, tail curled neatly around his body. Without warning, he stood. He looked toward the barn. Then looked at her. And walked. She hesitated for a moment. Then rose and followed. The grass was slick beneath her feet, the hem of her robe catching droplets as she moved. The barn stood darker now, less welcoming. The door creaked wider as the wind caught it, and Sage slipped inside before she reached it. When she entered, the loft window was open again. Wide this time. Rain blew in through the opening, hitting the floorboards in soft taps. Lena looked up into the dark and for the first time, felt the weight of it. Something had been there. Or still was. She stepped toward the ladder. Her hand brushed the rung. Not to climb. Just to feel it. Sage circled behind her, then lay down at her heels. Facing the wall. That night, sleep did not come. She lay in bed, eyes open to the ceiling, listening to the soft rise and fall of Sage's breath beside her. The baby kicked again. 3 times. Then settled. She didn't dream. But when morning came, she knew the shape of something had changed. Sage didn't lead her to the barn. He didn't move at all. He just watched her. Waited. As if passing the choice back to her. It started with the crib. One evening, after the last of the sun had vanished behind the trees and the shadows in the nursery turned a soft silver, Lena walked in to find Sage already inside. He wasn't at the base of the crib, like usual. He was standing on his hind legs, front paws balanced against the edge, his head bowed low, ears back, just staring into the empty space. Not moving. Not blinking. Just breathing, slow and deep, the way he always did when something mattered. Lena didn't speak. She stood in the doorway and watched, her hands folded just above the swell of her stomach. The room was quiet except for the ticking of the old clock above the dresser, the kind that sounded like footsteps in an empty hallway. After a long moment, Sage dropped back down and lay flat on the floor, head resting on his paws, eyes still trained on the crib's slats. He didn't look at her. That night, she didn't sleep. Not because of the discomfort or the dreams, but because something inside her was changing. There was a feeling she couldn't shake. Not fear. Not exactly. Just a growing sense that something was drawing closer. The next morning, Sage refused to move from the nursery. When she tried to call him out with soft whistles or steps down the hallway, he didn't respond. He stayed where he was, body stretched along the doorway, like a guard posted at the entrance of a holy place. It had been a week since he'd led her to the barn. And still, every morning at 5:47, he turned his head, toward the window, toward the clearing, then settled back in place. Waiting. Always waiting. Mark left for work early that day, a short goodbye and a longer silence between them. He'd been patient, supportive even, but she could feel his unease now. He didn't say it outright, but the way he looked at Sage had shifted. Not anger. Not dislike. Just mistrust. Like the bobcat knew more than a wild animal should. Like maybe it was time to question why they'd kept him at all. Lena didn't argue anymore. There was nothing to prove. Because deep down, she knew something was happening, something important, invisible, and sacred, and no one else needed to understand it for it to be real. By midday, the rain had returned. Not a storm, just a steady curtain falling across the windows, softening the light and muffling the world outside. Lena stood at the sink with her hands in warm water, washing a tiny blue onesie with a stain on the collar that wouldn't quite fade. She didn't hear the sound at first. Not until Sage growled. It was low. Not loud. But unmistakable. She turned, cloth still in her hands, water dripping onto the floor. Sage had risen from the hallway and was facing the front door now, body stiff, ears forward, tail low. A second sound followed. A thud. Then a soft metallic creak. The gate. No one was supposed to be here. The land they lived on stretched far, bordered by trees and wild growth. Visitors were rare. Deliveries even rarer. But someone was outside. Sage growled again, deeper now, and walked toward the window by the entryway. Lena followed, carefully, her breath tightening. Through the raindrops streaking the glass, she could make out a shadow at the edge of the path. Not close. Not moving. Just standing. Tall. Hooded. Face obscured by the downpour. She blinked and it was gone. No footsteps. No retreating shape. Nothing. Just the rain. Sage didn't move for a long time. And neither did she. That night, he wouldn't sleep. He paced the hallway from the nursery to the front door, back and forth, over and over. At first, Lena thought he was restless, but after the fifth round, she saw the pattern. He was tracing the borders of something. Mapping a boundary she couldn't see. A circle. A shield. Or maybe a warning. The baby kicked again. Harder than usual. She gasped, holding her side, breath shallow from the pressure. She sat down on the edge of the couch and doubled over slightly, waiting for the wave to pass. Sage came to her immediately. He rested his forehead against her knee and closed his eyes. And something inside her shifted. She began to cry, not loud, not sobbing, just a slow leak of emotion she hadn't known she was holding. The kind of tears that come when your body recognizes something your mind still doesn't understand. Because she knew, without question, that the baby inside her knew him. And somehow, he knew the baby. It wasn't logical. It wasn't even explainable. But it was real. The next morning, just before dawn, Lena rose without being led. She wrapped herself in her coat and stepped barefoot onto the porch. The ground was wet again, the grass glistening in the half-light. Mist hung low over the clearing. And beyond it, the barn door was open. Not wide. Just a crack. She looked back. Sage hadn't followed. He was watching from the hallway, eyes steady, unmoving. As if the barn was no longer his to guide her toward. As if now, it had become her turn to walk alone. She crossed the clearing slowly, the air cold against her skin. The wind moved through the trees in soft breaths, lifting strands of her hair across her cheek. When she reached the barn, she placed her hand on the door and pushed it open. The hinges groaned. The smell inside had changed. No longer just dust and wood. There was something else now. A sharpness. A memory. She stepped inside and paused at the base of the ladder. The loft was silent. The window above was wide open. And on the floor, just beneath the opening, was a small, perfect circle of paw prints in the dust. But they weren't Sage's. They were smaller. Lighter. Fresher. And leading toward the crib. Lena stood frozen at the base of the ladder, staring at the small paw prints in the dust. They circled the center of the loft and vanished near the edge, where the open window let in a cold wind that lifted the fine straw and made it dance like whispers in the air. These weren't Sage's prints. They were smaller. Softer. And fresh. She stepped back instinctively, heart racing, not in fear, but in the quiet jolt of something ancient. Instinct. An inner warning. Like the forest holding its breath before a storm. Outside, the trees stirred. The wind moved harder now, pushing clouds across the pale sky. The barn creaked gently, wood shifting with age, and for the first time in weeks, she felt alone. Completely. She turned and walked slowly back across the clearing, clutching the sides of her coat. Her feet slipped in the grass, cold and slick from the mist. Every step away from the barn made her want to look back. But she didn't. Not until she reached the porch. Sage was still at the doorway, sitting perfectly still. But something in his face had changed. She didn't know how she knew. She just did. That afternoon passed in silence. Mark didn't return her call. The power flickered once around noon, then settled again. Sage lay across the nursery threshold like he had for days, but his eyes were different now, wider, more alert, constantly scanning. He followed every sound. Every shift in light. Every breath she took. When night fell, she found herself holding her stomach more often, without meaning to. Cradling it. Shielding it. As if drawn into the same rhythm Sage had been following all along. She didn't sleep. Instead, she sat in the rocking chair by the crib, wrapped in a blanket, Sage curled tightly at her feet. Around 3 a.m., the baby kicked. Harder than ever. She gasped, leaning forward, hand gripping the chair's arm. The pressure was different now. Not painful, but full. Urgent. Like the beginning of something that had waited long enough. She closed her eyes, breathing slow. And then she heard it. A creak. Not inside. Outside. The front porch. She froze. Sage lifted his head, body rigid. Then he stood. And growled. The sound was low, deeper than she'd ever heard. It rumbled through the floorboards. It wasn't rage. It was warning. Lena rose to her feet, one hand bracing her stomach. She walked into the hallway, every step measured and silent. Sage was ahead of her, moving like a shadow, ears back, tail low. At the end of the hall, the front door stood closed. But the window beside it was open. It hadn't been earlier. Rain slipped through the gap, pooling on the sill, dripping softly onto the floor. Outside, the night was fogged and thick. But beneath the porch light, she saw them. Tracks. Wet. Small. Leading to the door. Then nothing. She stepped back. Sage growled again, louder now, moving toward the door, but not scratching, not charging. He stood pressed against it, nose high, breathing deep. Then he stopped. His ears turned slightly to the side. He listened. So did she. Nothing. But inside her, the baby stirred again, slow, rhythmic movements that pulsed like waves. She clutched the wall, steadying herself, and turned toward the nursery. That's when the light flickered. Once. Twice. Then went out. The house sank into silence. And in the dark, something opened. Not a door. Not a sound. Something inside her. She turned slowly. Sage was no longer at the front door. He stood behind her now. Looking at her. Then, without a sound, he walked past. Into the nursery. And stopped. In the center of the room. Looking up. Lena followed with slow steps, heart pounding. The crib was untouched. The room smelled the same, lavender, wood, rain. But Sage didn't move. He looked at the crib, then turned toward the window. The curtain fluttered. And through the gap, Lena saw it. A shadow. Perched at the edge of the clearing. Not a man. Not a monster. A creature. Thin. Silent. Not quite real. But there. Watching. She didn't scream. Didn't move. Just stood frozen, one hand on her belly, one on the crib. Sage let out one sound. Not a growl. Not a roar. A cry. Soft. High. Pained. Then he walked to the window. And leapt onto the ledge. One last glance at her. Then he was gone. Into the night. Lena cried out, not loudly. Just a broken breath. She ran to the window, the baby turning sharply inside her, her body aching with the strain. Outside, the clearing was empty. No movement. No shadow. No Sage. She waited for hours. Through the sunrise. Through the morning wind. Through the silence that followed. But he didn't return. Not that day. Not the next. The house felt different now. Not cold. But quieter. The space he filled stayed empty. The tracks outside faded in the rain. And Lena began to count the days not by the calendar, but by the way the baby moved at dawn. Always at 5:47. Every morning. As if something was still there. Still guarding. Still watching. Still waiting to return. Spring arrived quietly that year. It didn't announce itself with color or song, just warmth, the kind that soaked slowly into the wood of the house, crept through the cracks in the porch floor, and softened the earth beneath Lena's feet. The snow had long melted, leaving behind fresh grass, small wildflowers, and the scent of pine warming under a clear sky. The baby came 1 week after the last frost. The delivery was long but calm. No complications. No alarms. Just breath, pain, and release. When it was over, she held him against her chest and wept, not from exhaustion, but from a fullness she had no words for. His skin was soft and pink, his fingers curled around hers with a strength that felt older than him, as if he was holding something from before he was born. They named him Elias. She didn't tell Mark, but the name had come to her during the nights when she waited by the window. When the moon rose above the treetops and the clearing below remained empty. No movement. No Sage. Weeks passed. Then months. And still, Sage did not return. At first, Lena had looked every morning. Then only at dawn. Then only when the baby stirred in that now familiar rhythm, 5:47, almost without fail. He would stretch in her arms or kick softly in his crib. Not a cry. Just movement. A whisper of instinct. As if answering something outside the walls. Something still watching. The nursery stayed the same. Simple. Soft. Quiet. She never removed the blanket Sage had curled beneath. She never washed the windowsill he had last touched. Outside, the barn door remained closed now. She hadn't entered it since that morning. Not because she feared it, but because some places are meant to be left exactly as they were. Like footprints in snow, too sacred to step through. Mark adjusted slowly. He never asked about Sage. He stopped commenting on the crib blanket, or the way Elias only seemed to calm when facing the window. He never questioned why Lena still set out one small dish of water on the porch when the wind shifted. He just lived. Moved forward. But Lena remembered. Every day. Not in sorrow, but in rhythm. She carried Sage's presence not like grief, but like gravity. Constant. Grounding. There in every breath. One morning in late May, Elias stirred earlier than usual. The sun had barely touched the tops of the trees. Light fell across the nursery in long golden lines, the dust suspended like breath. Lena lifted him from the crib and stepped onto the porch barefoot, her robe trailing behind her. The air was warm and still. No wind. No sound. She sat on the porch swing and held Elias against her chest, his tiny fingers curled around the collar of her shirt. He was quiet, eyes wide, as if listening. And then, for the first time in months, she saw movement at the edge of the clearing. Not fast. Not clear. Just a shift. Something stepping out of the tree lean where the light touched the grass. Not a figure. Not a shadow. A shape. Low to the ground. Silent. It paused beside the old oak. Then sat. Watching. Lena didn't move. She didn't blink. She just breathed. And in her arms, Elias looked out too. The shape didn't come closer. Didn't need to. It just remained. A presence. A memory returned to form. Sage. Not wild. Not ghost. But something in between. The trees behind him shifted slightly, as if bowing in recognition. A breeze passed gently across the clearing, lifting the leaves, brushing across the porch. Lena closed her eyes. When she opened them again, he was gone. But not lost. Because some bonds are not broken by absence. Some guardians do not need to stay to remain. She looked down at Elias. He was smiling. Soft. Still. The sun rose higher, warming the porch, catching the edge of the rocking chair and the bowl of water beside it. And in that moment, nothing moved. But everything was understood.